So today, my talk, the title is From Baghdad to Baghpūr, Sailors and Slaves in Medieval Maritime Asia. Let me maybe start by clarifying the title itself. We know the word Baghdad is the name of the current capital of Iraq. The word itself actually came from Persian. It's composed of two parts. First, we have Bagh, which means God. And then we have Dod, which is from the Persian verb Dodan, which means to give. So when you combine the two parts, Baghdad, it simply means the land which is given by God, or the city given by God. And the second word in the title, Baghpūr, is also composed of two parts, Bagh, which means God again, and then Pur means son. So when you combine the two parts, again in Persian, Baghpūr, it simply means the son of God, which is the medieval Persian rendition of the Chinese term Tianzi, the son of heaven. So I tried to use these two rhyming words, Baghdad and Baghpūr, to really bring out the historical connection between these two lands. On the one hand, right, the Arabic Abbasid Empire, and on the other hand, the East Asian world, in particular the Chinese world. So when the medieval Arab and Persian merchants traveled from Baghdad, from Iraq, from the Abbasid Empire to the Chinese Empire, they were practically going from the land given by God to the land ruled by the Son of God. So I would like to officially start the talk with a story. You know, anthropologists like stories. The year is 1218 AD. In the Chinese dynastic calendar, this is the 10th year of Jiading in the southern Song dynasty, in the Nan Song. We know that by this period, maritime trade was essential for filling the imperial coffer in the southern Song dynasty. In that same year, 1218 AD, a Japanese monk of Tiantaizong by the name of Keisei, or Qingzheng Shangren in the Chinese reading, after a year of sojourn in China, was ready to sail home from the port of Quanzhou in Fujian. At the port, he met a couple of passengers who looked clearly different. He asked these passengers to write him something for reasons we'll explain shortly. And this is what we have of that original note now in Japan. So let's give the note a read. The Chinese explanation is composed of two separate notes. The one near the left margin says, 为遣至本朝卞和尚禅安，令书之彼和尚书方印度之风故也，沙门庆正谨记之. So the rough translation would be, I requested these monks to write about the foreign ways of India. So the note can be sent to the monastery of Bian monk of our land. And the Bian monk is Gao Bian, who is the Minghui monk, the teacher of Qingzheng Shangren in Japan. So this is note number one. And the second note at the bottom of the page of the folio has 此是南梵文字也，南无释迦如来，南无阿弥陀佛也。两三人到来博上，令书之。尔时大宋嘉定10年，丁丑于泉州记之。And the rough translation would be, this is the Nanban script. The words mean Namo Shaikamuni, Namo Abhitapa. 2 or 3 individuals came aboard, and I requested them to write this. Time was the 10th year of Jiading of Song, and location is Quanzhou. And this is how we know when the note and where the note was written. Now, the word Nanfan or Nanban literally means the southern barbarians. But apparently in this case, Keisei is not referring to who he thought were Indian monks as barbarians. So the word needs to be understood as referring in general to their location of origin. Now, by this point, you probably already realized that there might have been a complete misunderstanding here. The curly words these 2 or 3 foreign passengers left were clearly not in Sanskrit. They were in fact in Persian, in New Persian written in the Arabic script. So let's take a look at these Persian words. The first group is a mix and match from 2 Persian epic poems. The first one is Visurramin, and the second is Shahnameh. And both were composed only a century or so before this note was written, so not really long before the note was written. Although the stories they contain might have long been in popular circulation before their inclusion and likely systemization in these 2 works. And let's read these 2 lines of Persian poetry. جهان خرمی نماند فلک روزی دهد روزی ستاند جهان یادگار است ما رفتمی به مردم نماند به جز مردمی. The meaning is rather clear from these 2 lines. The rough translation would be, the world of joy lasts for no one. Fate giveth and fate taketh away. The world is forever, and we are but passers-by. Naught except courtesy remains of the ordinary man. So there's a sense of the fleetingness of life and of world, and what remains perpetual are our good deeds, which is quite apt, for seafarers in many ways. And the second group of Persian lines or Persian poetry is from unknown source, although the meaning is very clear. گردر اجلم مسامحت خواهد بود روشن کنم این دیده به دیدار تو زود یعنی خلیف گردد این کبود بدرود من است تو ز من بدرود. It even rhymes, even in this more or less fragmentary state. And the rough translation would be, should I live my full term by the mercy of fate, soon my eyes shall light up with your gracious sight. Should the firmament turn but against my lot, upon me be luck, and to you as well be good luck. This is literally a farewell message, right, given by a sailor or by a seafarer. So it's clear by this point that both poems, being extremely short and extracts either from known sources or from untraceable popular lore, are like sailor songs that contain lamentations of uncertain fate in the high sea, which means it's rather apt that the so-called foreign monks wrote these for Keisei as they part ways in the port of Quanzhou. It took about 8 centuries for Japanese scholars to realize that a note that had long supposed to be about Buddhism was in fact a beautiful, if not foreboding farewell message in classical New Persian. We cannot assume the identity of the visitors, for fluency in Persian epics is not necessarily a marker of ethnic identity. And yet we can probably be certain that there is a significant misrecognition involved. Keisei thought his new acquaintances were from India, and to impress his teacher Minghui, or the Bian Heshang, he asked them to leave a note explaining some exotic customs in the land of the Buddha. While in fact, the visitors were Persephone travelers well-versed in popular Persian epic tales. All of these happened in Fujian, at the port in Quanzhou. Now, in Keisei's defense, there may be a reason for his misrecognition. At the time of his writing, indeed, there was a mix-up of India and Persia, at least in name, if not exactly in geography. At least from the 8th century onwards, Chinese historical records tend to distinguish between 2 Persias, or 2 Bosi. One is the Persia we now know of, centered on Iran in West Asia. The other is what is at times referred to as Nanhai Bosi, or Bosi of the South Seas. Its location is still in dispute, though no scholars of medieval Asian geography would confuse it with a Persia that centers on contemporary Iran. And here the work of the German Orientalist Bertolt Laufer is instrumental. In Casey's time, perhaps the most prominent Nanhai Bosi, or Persia in the South Seas, is Basai, which in Jawi, the Javanese written in Arabic, is Farsi or Parsi. The labial dental f sound becomes bilabial p, which is an extremely common phonetic shift in the Austronesian languages. Now, here there is another possibility. Locals in Sumatra, on the island of Sumatra, in about the same period, also refer to their island as Pulau Percha, which literally means the island of rubber. Percha means rubber. Presumably because of its rich reserve of rubber trees, it is perhaps only a short leap from Pulau Percha, which is Sumatra, to the island of Persia. Another interesting detail, especially to those who are more familiar with medieval Arabic travelogues, is that Nubia is often referred to in medieval Arabic records as the land of gold, Bilad al-Dhahab. Incidentally, the name Sumatra comes from the Sanskrit Suvarna Bhumi, land of gold, also for its rich gold reserve, which means when we read in medieval Arabic travelogues, when it is mentioned that the ship sails out from Siraf, for instance, in contemporary Iran, and is bound for India and ends up in the land of gold, we would perhaps now be less certain whether they have landed in Nubia or have been blown off course to North Sumatra. A subsidiary question would that be to what extent the Indian Ocean was considerably smaller in the minds of medieval Arab and Persian travelers, to the point where the two lands of gold, Nubia and Sumatra, were perhaps considered to belong to the same oceanic world. This would be an essential question if we are to examine the intersection of race, blackness, religion, and nautical labor. But now let's again return to Basai. Basai is located in the north of Pulau Percha, close to Aceh and Lamuri, Lamuri being a place frequented by Arab and Persian merchants in medieval times. While the Aceh Sultanate was the earliest Islamic kingdom in Southeast Asia, while in particular in Indonesia, in the 12th century, when Kesey visited Song, northern Sumatra was still under the long shadow of Hindu Buddhism, likely under the rule of the declining Thalassocratic empire, Srivijaya. It's thus only natural that when Kesey set sail for home, he would mistake some foreign-looking Persian visitors, presumably merchants, who claimed to be from Bosi as Indian monks. For isn't Basai also in the South Seas? And isn't Basai also part of the wider Indian religious world? One thus wonders how many of the Persians in medieval Chinese records were West Asians, and how many were Indians and Southeast Asian Austronesians. And this is not even to start considering the many diversities amongst the people thus referred to as Indians or Austronesians. Now, I mentioned this apparently minor case and spent so much time on it because it, in a way, explains how I approach my topic in a nutshell. While I hope to examine the role of Black sailors and slaves in medieval trans-Asian trade, from the get-go, the research needs to grapple with pervasive misrecognitions that were not always or necessarily the outcome of ignorance or prejudice. At times when it's even unsure whether a certain visual or literary representation has been the case of misrecognition at all. Because of the involvement of multiple languages, among them Arabic, Persian, Chinese, and Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Indonesia, its contemporary name, and inclusion of vast oceanic territories, toponyms and ethnonyms often remain referentially afloat, pun unintended. It's thus often a fruitless forage to try to affix names to places or disambiguate layers of references beneath an apparently monolithic racial or ethnic appellation. What further complicates the matter is that the people I'm interested in, sailors, slaves, laborers on shore and on board, are rarely at the center stage of whatever literary or historical record in our possession. When we arrive in the early modern times, for instance, especially since the 16th century, where European records begin to appear en masse, first from the Portuguese, then the Dutch and the British, we surely have more access to a larger number of first-hand observations and descriptions of Asian nautical labor, though the extent to which these descriptions can be trusted is another matter. And I should also mention that a couple of 17th century Japanese painted screens constitute some of the most spectacular visual evidence of racialized colonial nautical labor in the early modern times. But when we turn our eyes to the medieval times, to the time before the arrival of the European colonials, research on nautical labor needs to confront at least three difficulties. The first has to do with the nature of the evidence at hand. Travelogues, stories of marvels, medieval geographical works, or even royal chronicles, whether in Arabic, Persian, Chinese, or Bahasa, often combine fact and fiction, mix reality and fantasy. The line between history and literature is barely visible, and this perhaps applies to much pre-modern historical writing. You know, the line between so-called history and literature is never really clear-cut. The second difficulty is but an aggravation of the first. Labor never was the center of any historical or literary record that survives to the present. Kings and queens, warriors and martyrs, even minor merchants could figure prominently in stories of marvels and epic poems, yet slaves and laborers rarely come into full view. We have to imagine us standing or sitting next to the historiographers, epic poets, or adventurous travelers and restore their vision, but shift the focus of that vision, drawing attention to the characters of servants, slaves, laborers, sailors, who are mostly treated as props on stage or as part of the background setting. If the records we have already combine fact and fiction, where they do pay scant attention to the people I wish to study, the proportion of fantasy increases still more, which means the reality of these people is doubly clouded. We have to work with, perhaps not necessarily against, misrecognitions, layered misrecognitions, and explore the significance of these misrecognitions without insisting on the veracity of our own hypothesis. Now, the third difficulty has to do with the fact that an enduring orality characterizes much of the written evidence that features in its research. Popular epics are committed to writing decades, if not centuries, after their oral transmission, and even once they have been written down, their oral transmission still constitutes the main medium of their circulation and popularization. We have seen this in the use of Visur-Ramin and Shahnameh in Kesey's story. When we turn our attention to Southeast Asia, where many, if not most, of the slaves and sailors were recruited, the oral and syncretic nature of historical memory, which again combines fact and fiction to a great extent, reigns supreme. It is stories, the charita, that bear the function of narrating history. This is clear even with a glimpse of some of the early chronicles of the Malay world. And these are some of the most important works about the early history of Southeast Asia. The first one on the left is Hikayat Raja Basai, the chronicle of the kings of Basai in North Sumatra. The second one is Babad Tanajawi, the chronicle or the annals of the land of Jawa or Java, mulai dari Nabi Adam sampai runtuhnya Mataram, from the prophet Adam to the collapse or the fall of Mataram, which is the last Islamic sultanate in Java. The last one is probably also the most famous one, Sejarah Melayu, the Malay Annals. There have been 2 or 3 English translations of the last one. And I don't think there are translations of the one in the middle. And this is, and this is the beginning of the Java chronicles. And it's basically a narration of the early genealogy of the sacred kings of Java. And this is written in the mid to late 17th century. So that's when Java has been entirely Islamized. But the genealogy combines Islam and Hinduism in really remarkable ways. And I can read the last part, right? It basically starts from the prophet Adam, and then Adam begot Sis, and Sis begot Nur Cahya begot Nur Rasa, and so on and so forth. And then in the last 2 sentences, we have Batara Guru berputra lima. So Batara Guru gave birth to 5 sons, and they are Batara Sembo, Batara Brahma, Batara Mahadewa, Batara Vishnu, Devi Shri. And these are all names of Hindu gods, but this is an Islamic genealogy. And this is committed to writing long after oral transmission. So you see the kind of oral and syncretic nature of this kind of even royal chronicles, not to mention popular stories. So with these 3 difficulties, how are we to say anything remotely reliable, not to mention useful, about the sailors and slaves, the dark-skinned laborers, often referred to as being black in Arabic and Chinese historical and literary writings? How did these laborers appear in these records? So let's start from some Chinese writings, then move on to the Arabic ones. In medieval Chinese records, the commonest term used to refer to black-skinned people is Kunlun. I'm sure many of you know this word. And this is one poem that we have from the late 8th to the early 9th century by Zhang Ji. 昆仑家住海中洲，蛮客将来汉地游。言语解教秦急了，波涛出过玉林洲。金环玉落曾穿耳，罗发长卷不裹头。自爱肌肤黑如漆，行时半脱木棉裘。And then we have a rough translation. Home to the Kunlun are the islands amidst the sea. Yet let forth by barbarian visitors, they have come to roam Han lands. Grasping language, they are the mythical minor birds. Crossing billowing waves, they first set foot on Yulin Island. I think this is in Guangxi. Gold rings once dangled luridly from their ears. With conch spiraled hair, long and coiling, they still refuse to bind their heads. Black as lacquer is the flesh and skin they cherish. They stride about half stripped of tree cotton garments. So what we learn from the poem about the Kunlun is that they come from the islands, from the South Seas, right? And they were brought by so-called barbarian visitors, in this case, presumably means Arab and Persian merchants, right? The incoming merchants from the seas. So they were probably, right, they were slaves or servants, or at least subsidiary to the incoming merchants. And they speak weird languages. And they were black, half naked, right? And they have long and coiling hair and refuse to wear headwear to bind their hair. And we have other records, very brief descriptions of the Kunlun. The first one is from Songshi at the top, from the late 10th century as well, 太平兴国2年, 前史蒲斯纳, which is likely Pushna, a Hindu name, 副使摩诃末, which is likely Muhammad or Muhammad or Mahmud, who knows, 判官蒲罗等供方物，其从者, again, subsidiary, right? Either servants or maybe slaves, or at least somebody who is subsidiary. 其从者, 目深体黑, deep set eyes, and black body or black skin. 谓之昆仑奴. And here we know, right, literally, it's Kunlun slaves as opposed to simply Kunlun. And the description at the bottom is a dictionary entry in 一切经验义 by Huilin from the 9th century. This is a dictionary for reading Buddhist texts. And we have one entry about the Kunlun language, the language spoken by the Kunlun. 上音昆下音论, 时俗语变异曰古论, which means Kunlun is not a Chinese word, right? It's a foreign word. That's why you also have gulun as another literary representation of the sound. 南海州岛中夷人也, from some island in the South Seas, and they are barbarians. 甚黑, very black. It's not simply black, it's very black. 裸形, naked. 能驯服猛兽犀象的, they can tame wild beasts, rhinos, elephants, and so on and so forth. 种类数般, there are many kinds of them. 即有僧旗、突米、古唐、革灭等. And I think Sengqi refers to Zanj, East Africans. 革灭 is likely Khmer from the mainland Southeast Asia. And I still don't quite know who the Tumi and Gutang are. But regardless of who they are, according to Huilin, 皆比贱人也. They're all base and lowly, equally base and lowly. 国无礼义, they're not civil. The lands have no civility. 超劫为祸, which means they're likely highwaymen or pirates, especially if they live along the coasts. 爱丹食人, cannibals. We see this as well in Arabic accounts. 如罗刹恶鬼之类也, they're like hungry ghosts or rakshasa, like the ghosts in Buddhism in particular. And sometimes, if you remember from Ramayana, Sri Lanka is normally thought of as the land of ghosts or land of devils. And this as well appears in Shahnameh, that Sri Lanka is the land of devils. South India, very close to Sumatra. 言语不正, they can't speak properly, they speak weird languages. 异语诸番, and this is an interesting detail as well. Their languages, the languages spoken by the Kunlun, are different from the languages of the rest of the barbarians. 善入水, 静日不死. They're great swimmers, and that they can stay in water for a whole day without being drowned. So superb swimmers. Black, half naked, cannibals, right? Uncivil, pirates and highwaymen, like hungry ghosts. There are different kinds of them. They speak different languages, and they are great swimmers. These are what we know from these, right, accounts that combine fact and fiction. It's clear that they combine fact and fiction. We also have other more brutal stories about the Kunlun, in particular the Kunlun Nu, the Kunlun slaves. And this is one from Taiping Guangji. Another common name given to Kunlun is Mohe. This name also appears frequently in medieval Chinese records from the Tang and Song dynasties. We don't know the origin of the term Mohe. And the term was especially popularized by a report in Taiping Guangji from the Tang dynasty, completed near the end of the 10th century from the same period. And it is said that on a family visit to Canton, Tao Xian, a descendant of the literary luminary Tao Yuanming, had the unusually good fortune to procure three exquisite treasures: an ancient sword, a jade ring, and a seafaring Kunlun slave, Kunlun Nu, by the name of Mo He, who is an extraordinary swimmer, brave and agile. Every time he traveled on beautiful waters, Tao Xian would drop the sword and ring and order Mo He to retrieve both, simply for the fun of it all. Such fun lasted for a couple of years, in the course of which Mo He lost a finger to a poisonous water snake, until at last, when they were undertaking a trip to Shisai Mountain in Hubei, and Tao Xian did the same since the water was dark and stagnant, and he thought there must be some monster therein, Mo He finally met his end. Tao Xian dropped the sword and the ring in water and commanded Mo He to jump in and retrieve both. So he did. The water turned and swelled, and after a while, Mo He returned, empty-handed and consumed. The sword and the ring can no more be retrieved, he lamented. Therein is a dragon of more than 2 zhang long, which is over 6 meters, and the sword and the ring have fallen in its path. Every time I extended my hands to reach for both, the dragon burst into a daunting rage. Thereupon Tao Xian replied, "The sword, the ring, and you are my 3 treasures. Now that the other 2 are lost, what use do I have of you? Return and retrieve both, or die doing it." Knowing that his end had arrived, a great thunderous roar was heard from Mo He, and his hair broke loose. Blood of scarlet red flowed from his bulging eyes, and lo and behold, in the slave went, and never did he return. Hours passed, and members of his body rose to the surface. There they lay foul and exposed. So this is one particularly brutal story and detailed story and very colorful story about the Kunlun Nu. So these are the Chinese records from roughly the 10th to the 11th centuries. Now, what record do we have in Arabic writings? We have one book, which I'm sure many of you know, from about the same period, the 10th or the 11th century AD, or CE, titled Ajaib al-Hind, Marvels of India. There have been first French, then English translations of the book, although the English translation is as much a rewriting as it is a translation. But even the French translation, done by the French Orientalist Louis Marcel de Vic in the mid-19th century, would inevitably lose much of its original flavor, especially the linguistic overlap or affinity between Ajaib al-Hind and other travelogues, other Ajaib of the same period, even with Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights. So there are some interesting literary overlap between these works. In the story I am about to recount at length, we do not see direct references to whether the slaves involved were dark complexioned. So I will leave that to your judgment. Now here is the story. Now the story was narrated by Abu Zahr al-Barakhti, a notable of the port of Siraf, who converted to Islam after being a fire-worshipping Magian following the religion of India. The story states that al-Barakhti's paternal grandfather traveled in a ship he owned, seeking to reach the island of Fansur. We'll come back to this island in a minute. And yet, as often happened in these stories, a violent gale blew them off course and threw them into the embrace of some unknown bay. Once the gale had passed, the sea was dead silent, with no wind to carry them where they needed to go. Unable to dock the ship, They drifted among the islands and were finally brought by the waves to one of them, on the shore of which they saw people resting and playing. Once the local people's trepidation and fear was put to rest, the stranded merchants began what they were best at, trade. The following, worth quoting at length, describes the scene at this particular moment. We motioned to them and asked, "Do you have any merchandise we can buy?" "We have nothing but slaves," thus they replied. So we said unto them, "Good, bring the slaves then." So they brought them. Never had we seen finer slaves. They were cheerful in nature. They sang and played and bantered and took delight in funny tales. Their bodies were soft like cream, and they appeared so agile and brisk, it seemed as though they were ready to take flight at any moment. Except that their heads were small and below their flanks were wings, like those wings that sea turtles have. We said unto them, "What the heck is this?" Laugh they did, and so they said, "All of the people of these islands are like this, so this is all you can have." They motioned to the sky. Indeed, God created us this way, so we saw nothing awry in this shape of ours. This is an opportunity, we said amongst ourselves, as we saw this as a chance for some good catch. Every one of us brought to the extent he could afford. We emptied our ship of goods and loaded it full with slaves and provisions. No sooner had we bought some slaves from them did they bring us even more beautiful ones, and before long our ship was freighted with creatures finer than which no one had ever laid eyes upon. Alas, if we had been allowed to bring this business to fruition, we would have enriched generations of our progenies. When the moment of departure arrived, a strong gust began to blow to us from these islands and towards our land. We bid farewell, and they said unto us, "Come again, God willing, inshallah." We did wish to return, and so did the captain, who, however, desired to come back with his ship alone, sans the merchants, so that he can buy more slaves. For the whole night, he and his men studied the stars and the constellations and the horizons and the pathways for departure and return. All of us were over the moon. At the break of dawn, off we went from the island, riding the wind that blew toward our land. Once the island had vanished from view, some of the slaves began to weep. Our hearts tightened from such wailing. But then some of them said unto others, "Why are you crying? Come, let us dance and sing and find merriment." Then all the slaves stood, and dance they did, and they sang and laughed. We found this quite marvelous. We said to ourselves, "Well, at least this is better than weeping." So we left them to it, and each minded his own business. Little did we know that they were playing fools on us. By God, I swear that I saw them fly into the sea like locusts, and the ship rode immense swells as high as mountains and as terrifying as lightning. We did not gain a clear sight of them until the ship had overtaken them for about 1 league. We heard them sing and laugh and flap their wings. Then we knew that they would not have done this had they possessed no might to conquer the terror of the high sea. And now it was all but impossible for us to bring them back. End of story. In this story, the slaves were also superb swimmers, to the point where their bodies border upon bestiality. The island of Fansur likely refers, again, to Sumatra, and specifically to Barus in Western Sumatra, which was a key stop for medieval travelers. I should add as well that this is still under dispute, the identification of Barus, contemporary Barus, with Fansur. From the same place, Fansur in particular, we have in later times, in the 16th century, Hamza Fansur, an eminent but mysterious Sufi saint who was entombed in Mecca, known there as Sheikh Hamza bin Abdullah al-Fansuri. Now, the story itself seems to suggest at least two things worthy of attention. First, Arab merchants might have been involved in slave trade in Southeast Asia, if not systematically, at least on an ad hoc basis when it is good business. And second, in this practice, they are very much aided, helped by locals along the trade routes. Trade in slaves is pervasive in the many local societies they pass by, and there is a strong possibility, based on evidence from similar stories, that some coastal populations, being ethnic or racial minorities, likely native aboriginals, later subsumed under the general category of orang laut, or the sea people, were known as sea nomads as well, either because of war or debt, could have been subject to slavery and sold off to incoming merchants. And some of them might have ended up in China or elsewhere in Southeast Asia as the Kunlun from the South Seas, the superb swimmers who became the domestic servants or playthings to the Chinese aristocracy in Tang and Song dynasties. This is not to say that people like orang laut, the sea people, have always been in such subsidiary position. Stratification in native societies and frequent warfare mean no one can extricate themselves from playing a more or less active part in slave trade. And orang laut, for one thing, were by turns slave and slaver, merchant and pirate. Piracy is another fantastic topic as well in this case. The rise of the Malacca Sultanate, for instance, would have been impossible without the significant military help from orang laut, who, after thus emerging into somewhat mainstream history, again faded into the background afterward. Now, where do these stories lead us? Here we are in the territory of speculation. Let me brave a rudimentary hypothesis. Thus far, our research on medieval maritime trade across the wider Indian Ocean world, we have rarely paid attention to peoples who are on the margins of empires, whether such empire being the Sasanian, the Abbasid, Tang, Song, Srivijaya, or Majapahit. Yet, is it not likely that it is precisely these people, often living along the coasts, and thus the first to come into contact with incoming travelers, who play multiple roles in this contact? At times, they are enslaved and sold off by those living in the hinterland, where political power often lies in the archipelagic world. At others, they are pirates or small vendors. They can be both as well, feeding on the business of passing ships. They enter historical records where their power grows and their military assistance is solicited or recruited, and in turn fade into the background after these moments that are key to royal or dynastic histories. In other words, has there been an encompassing indigenous world composed of an extraordinary amount of communities and life worlds of diverse and intersecting cultures and languages, in which the Persians and the Arabs, and later the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British were merely clueless latecomers? Is there a pre-modern indigenous trans-regionalism that unfolds at the overlapping margins of multiple empires, forming a massive human infrastructure that is barely visible and decipherable and clouded by multiple layers of fiction and fantasy? What can this subaltern trans-regionalism tell us about the multiracial or multi-ethnic Black labor across the Indian Ocean world? It's probably unwise to end one's talk with a question, but that's how it is. Thank you.